Welcome to Hatcher History, the past unlocked, telling the story of the people, places and decisions that changed everything. At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain was still very much controlled by the aristocracy, at the top of which sat the new king, Edward VII. Seen as something of a playboy in his youth, he was to breathe new life into the monarchy during his short reign after years of neglect by his reclusive mother. The Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, was a Conservative peer governing from the House of Lords, a man who was approaching the end of his long and distinguished career. As his own Foreign Secretary for much of his time at Downing Street, he is best known for Splendid Isolation. This had aimed to keep Britain out of a raft of European alliances that had grown up in the 1890s. His successor, Arthur Balfour, however, was to abandon this soon after arriving at Downing Street, forging instead agreements with France, the Entente Cordiale, and with Russia to counter rising German aggression. This anti-German pact became known as the Triple Entente, and this stance was continued under two Liberal Prime Ministers, Henry Campbell Bannerman and his successor, Herbert Asquith, who took over suddenly in 1908. This was because heart problems forced Campbell Bannerman to step down, with doctors advising that he was too ill to be moved from his bed at number 10 Downing Street. Dying there 3 weeks later, he was to be the only holder of the position of Prime Minister to pass away at the official residence. Asquith was to remain in charge of the country until 1916, leading Britain into an era of political reform and then into a world war. When the new king came to the throne, Britain was fighting the Boer War in southern Africa. Initial manoeuvres had seen the well-organised Boers gain the upper hand, launching attacks on British positions in Natal and Cape Colony. In particular, this led to the besieging of Ladysmith, Mafeking and Kimberley, with the fate of each avidly followed by a jingoistic British public in the popular newspapers of the day. Ladysmith was a major garrison town with about 13,000 British troops billeted there. Kimberley, a diamond mining town and the centre of the De Beers Empire, had a large civilian population and a garrison led by Cecil Rhodes himself. But it was the fate of Mafeking in the Northern Cape that was particularly followed in England, and its relief in May 1900 was wildly celebrated across Britain. However, British reinforcements from India and Britain soon began arriving in southern Africa, and early in 1900 this had led to a sustained counter-offensive. Winston Churchill, initially in South Africa as a war correspondent, had enlisted early in the war before being captured in Natal in November 1899. A month later, his escape from prison in Pretoria and his mad dash for freedom across the border into Portuguese-controlled Mozambique gained him much public acclaim when it was reported in the English press soon after. By June 1900, Britain had taken the upper hand, forcing President Kruger into European exile, while conventional fighting to all intents and purposes ended at this stage. The Boers were not beaten, launching a prolonged guerrilla war. In response, Lord Kitchener implemented a brutal scorched-earth policy, burning Boer farms and burning Boer crops. He also ordered civilians suspected of harbouring Boer guerrillas into internment camps, where 20,000 died, primarily from disease. The Boers eventually surrendered, signing a treaty in 1902. This brought the Boer Republic into the British Empire while allowing a certain amount of independence and political autonomy. In 1910, Britain unified its southern African territories into the Union of South Africa. Back home in Britain, though, the country remained uniquely class-structured as the Victorian age gave way to the Edwardian period. This allowed the aristocracy to maintain its privileged position within British society well into the new century. However, the growing power and authority of the House of Commons signalled that a shift towards a more democratic system was on the way. This was because Britain's vast empire and its industrial might had largely been built by the middle classes. They had built and managed the factories, the banks, docks, shipping lines and railways, as well as the imperial commerce that flowed into its docks. But the willingness of the aristocracy to recruit from the upper reaches of the middle class was an important reason for its survival. Ironmasters and bankers, shipping magnates, and railway entrepreneurs were happy to be ennobled into the life that revolved around the country estate and the House of Lords. The public school system and Oxbridge also were crucial in maintaining Britain's distinctive class makeup. After the Liberal landslide victory of 1906, the government of Henry Campbell Bannerman introduced a series of reforms to improve the condition of the English people. David Lloyd George, the Welsh Chancellor, and Winston Churchill, a young president of the Board of Trade from 1908, spearheaded these changes. Old age pensions, free meals and mandatory medical inspection in schools were introduced, while in 1911 the National Insurance Act gave limited support during sickness and unemployment. Though basic, these reforms laid the groundwork for the future welfare state. To pay for these liberal reforms, the 1909 People's Budget aimed to tax the rich heavily, leading to a 2-year standoff with the House of Lords, where the Tory majority kept on voting down the will of the elected government in the lower house. Eventually, this resulted in the Parliament Act of 1911, which reduced the power of the Lords, especially over the finances of the nation. However, the working class were also becoming increasingly organised, with the trade unions growing in strength. The working man had been enfranchised in the 1880s, and the late Victorians saw an improvement in living conditions as a result of increased government intervention. The first working class MPs had been elected in the 1890s, paving the way for the first Labour Prime Minister in 1924. One notable section of Britain's population remained excluded from the political process. John Stuart Mill, the great Victorian philosopher, had advocated for female suffrage in the 1860s, and by the turn of the century, the women of New Zealand had been granted the right to vote, although they could not stand for Parliament themselves until 1919. In Britain, various suffrage movements had emerged, but it was the militant Women's Social and Political Union, founded in 1903 by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, that became the most prominent. In 1913, a suffragette died after throwing herself in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby, while hunger-striking protesters were force-fed under the barbaric Cat and Mouse Act. Progress was slow until World War I, when women's contribution to the war effort led to limited enfranchisement in 1918. This gave the vote to all women over 30, as well as to those who satisfied certain property qualifications. This gave the vote to some 8.4 million British women. In 1928, 10 years later, the Equal Franchise Act passed through Parliament, giving all women 21 and over the right to vote, the same rights that had been granted to men in 1918. Thanks so much for watching our video today. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you did so, please think about subscribing or giving us a thumbs up. Please follow Hatcher History on Instagram or at .shop.